We're going to talk a little bit about a structure of a coaching session. So we think about a coaching session that runs for 20 minutes, as these ones are in this FCC Get Smarter course. They start at 0 minutes, clearly, nothing happens there, and they end at 20 minutes. So let's think about how this structure might work. And I think a nice way to do this is just to break it into three and to say, right, this part here is the beginning and this part here is the end. So let's start by looking at that and saying what's in the beginning and what's in the end. In the beginning, it's the welcome, it's the hello, it's the link from the last session, what did we talk about, and it's diving into the objectives. And the best way to do that is to ask the client, so what would be most useful for you to focus on in this session? What are your objectives? What would you like to get out of this session? You just need to ask one of those, don't ask all three at once. So you ask, what are the objectives? And you could even ask it more specifically. Some people like this, is to say, so by the end of this 20 minutes, what would you like to be taken away from this session? And that immediately puts them into a fast forward mode to think about, well, what would I like to take away from this session? So you list some objectives. If you're on the telephone, then that's fine, or Skype, then that's fine. You ask your client to list them. Have they got them? Ask them to read them back to you so that you've got a clear picture of what they understand by the objectives to be. And that's the beginning, and you are ready to go. So now let's jump and say, okay, what happens at the end? And then we'll look at what happens in the middle lastly. So what happens at the end is to say, right, let's summarize. So, and the best way again to do this is to ask your client. So we're reaching the end of the session. Why don't you summarize back for me what it is you're taking away from the conversation we've had? How's that sound? So we're reaching the end of the session. Why don't you summarize back to me what you're taking away from the session? And ask the client to list those things that they're taking away. Forces them to think, and they might say, well, actually not very much, or they might say, wow, incredible insight that I had just speaking through this. It's very seldom you'll find that a client who's been engaged and focused in a session doesn't take away something valuable. So that's to summarize, and then the next time. So next steps. So what happens between now and the next time we meet is the first next, and the second question is next time. And again, you can do this in different ways, but it might be something along the lines of, well, based on this session, then what do you think we should be focusing on next time? Or even more specifically, you could ask and say, so what do you think our objective should be for the next session? And that's the end of the session. You wrap up, thank you, that's great. Well, we'll focus on that. We'll make sure you've set up the next session, the time, all the logistics of it, but you do that right at the very end once you've rounded out. Try not to mix that up, because I find that gets a bit confusing, where in one sentence you're talking about logistics and then you're jumping back and you're talking about summarizing the session. And careful not to fall into the trap of doing all the work for your client and summarizing everything for them. Let them summarize, let them tell you, and it allows you to check what they're taking away from the session. So that's it. So that's our wrap up. So let's just give these a name. This is our wrap up. Over on this side here, we said this would be our intro. So that leaves us then with the question, so what happens here in the middle? And the middle is quite simply the link between the objectives and the summary. And that sounds very simple, I know. But if you start with the objectives and they're very clear, leading into this middle bit, it is really just about the skill of introducing and starting and then stepping back from and allowing your client to do the thinking and the talking around the objectives. So it allows you're clear on your objectives so you can get out the way, and your client can tell you how they're going to achieve the objectives. So to kick that off, a good way to start that might be something along the lines of, so if those are the objectives, all right, that's the objectives. If those are the objectives, then where would be the most useful place for us to start? Or if those are the objectives, how would you like to go about talking about this? Or if those are the objectives, what do you think is the most important thing that we could talk about? So really just an open question leading from the objectives. And as you move through this middle area, it's really, it's talk, 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 and you go through. It's punctuated with a couple of questions from your side. All right, so careful here not to you be the person who's driving the whole conversation. It's really a very light touch, and you're hoping that the client will do most of the talking with a little bit of input from yourself. And then as you're starting to get towards the end, you then lead in and you say, right, so now we've spoken a lot. The client's done, let's say, 70% of the talking, perhaps even 80% of the talking, but 70% is probably not bad. 70 to 80% of the talking. By talking that much, it's impossible for them not to have formed new thoughts and new ways of thinking about what it is they're trying to do. And towards the end, you then move into the summary and you say, right, now why don't you summarize that back for me? So that's a very simple structure that you can use for a coaching session. And it doesn't matter if it's 20 minutes or it's 2 hours. We could just as easily have done this, and this, instead of 20 minutes, we could have said this is 120 minutes or 90 minutes or 60 minutes or 50 minutes, whatever you like. It can be anything you like. Depends on your model, how you work, and you can structure your session around that. Very simple. An intro, a wrap up, and the main body of the coaching session sits in the middle. Have fun. Cheers. Bye.